Welcome back, class. We're continuing our conversation on Chapter 5 Sex, Gender, and Sexuality. So, basically, I want to remind you too of couple of videos that you need to look at if you haven't already. Let's Talk About Sex, which will cover, among many things, the sexual response cycle and gender nonconformity, focusing on things such as sexual orientation. So, sexual dysfunctions. Impaired sexual arousal or functioning often involves sexual motivation, especially sexual motivation and arousal. With males, it includes such things as erectile disorder or premature ejaculation. In females, it may include female orgasmic disorder and female sexual interest arousal disorder, and sometimes may involve such things as paraphilias. So, a sexual dysfunction, a problem that consistently impairs sexual arousal or functioning. Erectile disorder, the inability to develop or maintain an erection due to insufficient blood flow to the penis. Premature ejaculation, sexual climax that occurs before the man or his partner wishes. Female orgasmic disorder, distress due to infrequently or never experiencing orgasm. And paraphilias, sexual arousal from fantasies, behaviors, or urges involving non-human objects, the suffering of self or others, and or non-consenting persons. The American Psychological Association classifies people as disordered only if they experience sexual desire in unusual ways and the person experiences distress from unusual sexual interest, or the desire entails harm or risk of harm to others. Paraphilias will include such things as necrophilia, exhibitionism, and pedophilia. Another aspect of sexual interaction is going to be sexually transmitted infections, or formerly known as sexually transmitted disease, or STD. So STI/STD. Every day, more than 1 million people worldwide will acquire an STI. Acquired immune deficiency syndrome, AIDS, a life threatening sexually transmitted infection caused by the human immunodeficiency virus, HIV, depletes the immune system and leaves the person vulnerable to infections. So, your immune system, once it has been compromised, you are more likely to catch other types of ailments, like a cold that develops ultimately into pneumonia or something of that nature. And that is what you die from. You die from the complications brought about because of AIDS. The CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, report sexually active 15 to 24-year-olds are at higher risk for STIs than older adults. Condom use effectiveness varies by infection. 80% effectiveness against transmission of HIV when used with an infected partner, less effective with skin to skin STIs such as herpes. Worldwide, women's AIDS rates are increasing fastest, partly because the virus is passed from man to woman much more often than from woman to man. So, looking at the biopsychosocial influences on sexual motivation. So, we see the biological influences, psychological influences, and the social cultural influences. Compared with our motivation for eating, our sexual motivation is less influenced by biological factors. Psychological and social cultural factors play a larger role. So the biological influences are sexual maturity, how mature the individual is to take part in sexual intercourse, sex hormones, especially testosterone. The psychological influences are exposure to stimulating conditions or sexual fantasies. And the social cultural influences are family and society values, religious and personal values, cultural expectations, and of course, the media. All of these biopsychosocial factors play a significant role on one's sexual motivation. The psychology of sex, external stimuli. Research indicates exposure to sexually explicit material has adverse effects in three ways. 1. Believing rape is acceptable. 2. Reducing satisfaction with a partner's appearance or with a relationship. And 3. Desensitization. Imagine stimuli. Sexual desire and arousal can be imagined. The brain has been called the most significant sex organ. People with spinal cord injury have reported feeling sexual desire. Approximately 95% of people reporting having sexual fantasies, so it is something that can be common. Male fantasies tend to be more frequent, more physical, and less romantic than female fantasies. Sexual risk taking in teen pregnancy. Environmental factors that influence a higher teen pregnancy rate: communication about birth control, impulsivity, alcohol use, and, of course, mass media. Norms of unprotected promiscuity, sleeping around. Media help write the social scripts that affect our perceptions and actions. So, oftentimes you may see some people at a party in a movie, at a party, and then they may engage in unprotected sex. Or some romantic comedy in a movie where you see sexual partners change from person to person and again may be unprotected. The mass media does have a great deal of influence on people's behavior, particularly teens' behavior. Sexual risk taking in teen pregnancy. Factors that predict sexual restraint. These are the factors that tend to be associated with not engaging in teenage sexual behavior: higher intelligence, religious engagement, the presence of a father, and participation in service learning programs. So these factors can predict sexual restraint or delaying engaging in sexual behavior. Sexual orientation. Sexual orientation is the enduring sexual attraction toward members of one's own sex, homosexual orientation, attraction toward the other sex, heterosexual orientation, or attraction toward both sexes, bisexual orientation. In all cultures, heterosexuality has prevailed, but homosexuality has existed. Where same sex relationships are illegal, the prevalence of people who are lesbian, gay, or bisexual is no different. So it's not types of orientations or behaviors that can be legislated. Illegality has nothing to do with the numbers of individuals who would identify themselves as being homosexual, lesbian, gay, or bisexual. Survey results vary by survey methods and population. Less open responses are found in less tolerant places. Exclusively homosexual. 3 to 4% of men have identified themselves as exclusively homosexual, and 2% of women. In the United States, 5% of men and 13% of women report some same sex sexual contact during their lives. According to the APA in 2009 research, efforts to change sexual orientation are unlikely to be successful and involve some risk of harm. Research also indicates that women's sexual orientation tends to be less strongly felt and potentially more fluid. Their sexual activity level also varies more. Origins of sexual orientation. Homosexuality is not linked to problems in parent child relationship. does not involve a fear or hatred of the other sex, and is not significantly linked to childhood sexual victimization. There is a lack of evidence for environmental causes of homosexuality. It does not mean there aren't any that exist. Just currently, there's a lack of evidence that environmental factors play some significant role in homosexuality. Instead, homosexuality seems to have biological influences as investigated in studies of same sex behavior in other species. Gay straight brain differences, genetic influences, and prenatal influences seem to play a role in one's orientation. Same sex attraction in other species. Same sex behavior has been observed in several hundred species. For example, swans, penguins, grizzlies, gorillas, monkeys, flamingos, and owls. So it is not something that seems to be uniquely part of the human condition. Same sex attraction seems to be something that goes across species. Gay straight brain differences. We do see in some research that there seems to be differences in brain organization or structure. One hypothalamic cell cluster is smaller in women and gay men than in straight men. The anterior commissure is larger in gay men than in straight men. Gay men's hypothalamus reacts in the same way as a straight woman's hypothalamus to the smell of sex related hormones. Genetic influences. Shared sexual orientation is higher among identical twins than among fraternal twins. Remember, identical twins share the exact same DNA. Sexual attraction in fruit flies can be genetically manipulated. Male homosexuality often appears to be transmitted from the mother's side of the family. Some of the prenatal influences. Altered prenatal hormone exposure may lead to homosexuality in humans and other animals. Men with several older biological brothers are more likely to be gay, possibly due to maternal immune system reaction. So let's examine this real quickly. Altered prenatal hormone exposure may lead to homosexuality in humans and other animals. We talked about this in the previous lecture as well as the previous segment during this chapter. That during the fourth and fifth months, your brain is going to be, while you're inside your mother still, your brain is going to be bathed in certain hormones. And your brain is going to be wired in a male or female fashion. So the amount of hormone that is bathing the unborn child may have some sort of influence in the orientation they may have later in life. And in the video that you saw with gender nonconformity, we saw some of the research behind the idea that men with several older biological brothers are more likely to be gay. So the consistency of the brain, genetic, and prenatal findings clearly leads to a biological explanation of sexual orientation. Here's a graph of the older brother effect, which was discussed in your video, showing a greater likelihood, depending on how many older brothers you have, a percent increase for only right-handed individuals, saying the probability that they are homosexual. So, researchers Ray Blanchard offers these approximate curves depicting a man's likelihood of homosexuality as a function of his number of older brothers. This correlation has been found in several studies, but only among right-handed men, as about 9 in 10 men are right-handed. Remember, this is a correlational study, so it does not mean one causes the other, but there seems to be something that makes it correlated with homosexuality orientation. Some gay straight trait differences. Research indicates that homosexuals and heterosexuals differ in the following traits: spatial abilities, fingerprint ridge counts, uh, auditory system development, handedness, occupational preferences, relatively finger lengths, age of onset of puberty in males, birth size and weight, sleep length, physical aggression, walking style, and gender nonconformity. On average, the evidence is strongest for males. Results for gays and lesbians fall between those of straight men and straight women. Three biological influences, the brain, genetic, and prenatal, may contribute to these differences. We also see differences in spatial abilities and sexual orientation. Which of the three figures can be rotated to match the original figure? Straight males tend to find this type of mental rotation task easier than do straight females, with gays and lesbians falling in between. Cross culturally, men think more than women about sex, and men are more likely to think that casual sex is acceptable. Why might natural selection have resulted in greater male promiscuity? So, what we're talking about here is male female differences in sexuality. Cross culturally, men think more about sex and are more likely to think it is casual and can be acceptable than women do. Why might this have something to do with natural selection? One of the things that natural selection talks about is making sure that we have the ability to have our genes survive. One of the things that they talk about as a possibility when it comes to this idea of male promiscuity is that it is one way in order to increase the likelihood of your genes surviving by getting multiple partners pregnant. So, an evolutionary explanation of human sexuality, male female difference in sexuality. Compared with lesbians, gay men, like straight men, report more interest in uncommitted sex, more responsiveness to visual sexual stimuli, and more concern with their partner's physical attractiveness. Gay male couples report having sex more often than do lesbian couples. Men who have the trait of promiscuity are more likely to have their genes continue and even spread in the next generation. There is little cost to spreading their genes. For women, a trait of promiscuity does not greatly increase the number of babies and would have greater survival costs. Historically, pregnancy was often life threatening. So, when it comes to survivability and increasing the likelihood of having more babies, for women, promiscuity is not a trait that seems to work. Researchers asked a sample of U.S. adults whether they agreed or disagreed with the following statements. For each item, give your best guess about the percentage who agreed with the statement. If two people really like each other, is it all right for them to have sex, even if they've known each other for a very short time? Two, I can imagine myself being comfortable and enjoying casual sex with different partners. Three, affection was the reason I first had intercourse. Four, I think about sex every day or several times a day. And five, pornography is morally acceptable. You can easily figure out the percentage of males who would agree or females would agree and how those two groups would differ in their predicted responses. Men prefer, in natural selection and mating purposes, men prefer women with signs of future fertility, narrower waist, fuller figure, and age of peak fertility. Women prefer men with loyal behavior and physical/slash social power and resources. Why might natural selection have resulted in these mating preferences? So, male choices are optimized for the chance of producing offspring, fertility, for example. Female choices are optimized for offspring survival. The father or the man will stay around. They have power for protection, and they have resources for paying the bills, so to speak. So it comes down to this: men choose widely, and women choose wisely. Most psychologists agree that natural selection prepares humans for survival and reproduction. Critics of evolutionary psychology research note these limitations. Evolutionary psychology starts with an effect and works backward to explain what happened. More immediate explanations are better understood through social learning theory than through decisions made by our distant ancestors. Social consequences of evolutionary explanation are problematic, and some traits and behaviors are difficult to explain by natural selection. Human sexuality research does not aim to define personal meaning of sex, but one's significance of such intimacy is its expression of our profoundly social nature. So, human sexuality research does not aim to define the personal meaning of sex, but one significance of such intimacy is the expression of our social nature. For both men and women, but especially for women, orgasm occurs more often when sex happens in a committed relationship rather than what we refer to as a sexual hookup. Sex is socially significant act. Achieving orgasm alone is less satisfying, with much less of a surge in the prolactin hormone associated with sexual satisfaction and satiety than after sex with a loved one. Thanks to overlapping brain reward areas, sexual desire and love do feed each other. Reflections on nature and nurture of sex, gender, and sexuality. Our ancestral genetic history helped form humans as a species. Where there is variation, natural selection, and heredity, there will be evolution. Our culture and experiences also form us. In many modern cultures, gender roles are merging. Swift changes in gender roles and sexual attitudes have occurred since 1960. Biology does not fix gender roles. We cannot excuse our failings by blaming them solely on bad genes or bad influences. In reality, we are both the creatures and the creators of our worlds.